Hey everybody, Matt Wallace bringing you AI every day. So today I've got to talk about Llama. It just came out. It's the hottest new thing. The Llama 2 model released by Meta and their research teams has been released under a fairly permissive open source license, and it immediately moved to the top of the open model leaderboards in almost every assessment that I have seen so far. It actually comes in three different versions, a 7 billion, a 13 billion, and a 70 billion parameter version. Obviously, the 70 billion one is the highest performing, but I think that there were improvements across the board, much like Llama 1, which came in several different model sizes. At this point, you still have to actually go to Meta's site and agree to their terms and conditions and have your email line up with your Hugging Face email to get access to it on Hugging Face. But there's one other really funny term that I observed that it made me literally laugh out loud when I read it, and I'll just read it to you. Additional commercial terms if on the Llama 2 version release date, the monthly active users of the products or services made available by or for licensee or licensee's affiliates is greater than 700 million monthly active users in the preceding calendar month, you must request a license from Meta, which Meta may grant you at its sole discretion. And it basically says you can't otherwise use this. And so basically, you get to take this model, use it, modify it, reproduce it, redistribute it, etc. And it looks mostly like any sort of typical open source license with commercial use permitted, except for this hilarious carve out of basically Google, you can't use this, TikTok, you can't use this, possibly Snapchat, you can't use this. Pretty funny to see that carve out. So that having been said, I will pop up a little view. It comes literally from their Llama 2 intro blog on Hugging Face that shows different open source models here, what license they have, whether they can do commercial use, and what their leaderboard score is. And you can see that there's a pretty distinct difference between some of these. So you look at something like the Falcon 40B model. That was actually up until this week in this release, that was the top performing commercially available model. The Falcon team, I think, was somewhere out of the Middle East. They just did their 40 billion model. It became the largest. It topped the Mosaic 30 billion parameter model. It's even interesting though, because the Mosaic 30 billion model, the base model, the GPT part of the model was commercially usable. There's a Mosaic 30 billion instruct version, so a real reinforcement learning trained version of that model that makes it more chatbot-like. Because of the scenarios that were used for the chat training, it could no longer be fully commercially available. And so I think it has a CC by non-commercial share-alike license. So it's still open source, but no longer commercially viable. You'd have to do your own reinforcement learning to use it commercially. That wasn't true for Falcon. There was a Falcon 40B instruct model that could be used commercially. Yet you see here from this chart that the Llama 2 70B is exceeding the performance of that model. And it's, again, truly open source. Now, you'll also notice that the 13 billion parameter model is doing really well here under Llama 2. So it's actually outscoring the Mosaic 30B model. And I suspect this 30B on here, because it's this commercial use check, is actually not the chat chain version. Most of these models, I feel like, do better on the leaderboard after they have reinforcement learning. And so it wouldn't surprise me. You can see it's just barely behind the Falcon 40 billion parameter model. This could make a really big difference, though, in terms of hardware that things can run on. And it remains to be seen how people will work with Llama 2. The Llama 1 models already had an incredibly rich reception by the ecosystem of researchers because of how open they were and because they were relatively performant to begin with. People did a lot of training on top of those models. And so now with this Llama 2, now that it is available for commercial use and also very performant, I think we're going to see just an explosion of use cases here. Now, I noticed in the release notes that they mentioned that the 7 and 13 billion parameter versions should run on the Hugging Face hosted LLM hardware on a 40 gig A100 card. And then you want the 80 gig card for the 70 billion parameter version. So Falcon 40B, which was, from my perspective, from open source, commercially viable, that was state of the art, literally last week. Now, 70 billion parameter Llama 2 model will take that crown, but the fact that you can get very close to that performance on the 13 billion Llama 2 model, to me, is also a big deal. And it certainly makes me wonder if other types of hardware, older things like the P100 GPUs in Azure, V100 cards that you see all over, the T4 GPUs that Google still has available, as well as consumer cards like my RTX if they're able to run them. I think there's some really interesting use cases, incidentally, in the future. Like, for example, video games being able to use language models to essentially generate custom content for users. And this is getting really close in my mind because of this performance, the availability for commercial use, et cetera, to being able to do that. It's a really interesting idea to push it down onto a user devices. Now, of course, we know that there are tricks to make any of these things run. There's a pretty interesting, publication where somebody made the Bloom 176 billion parameter model run purely on CPU, but it only generated like one token every 4 minutes. So it's going to be interesting to see at some point if someone manages to concoct a way to use something like the mixture of experts model that GPT-4 is purportedly using now and use it pushed down onto consumer devices. It'd be really interesting to see, say, half a dozen Llama2 13 billion parameter models or something that could run on consumer hardware that collectively could generate much better answers than a single model, but wouldn't actually need to use all of the GPU memory of an A100 card to even get the inference done. Really cool. Check it out. I am excited to dabble with this one, and I'll be back soon talking about the GPT architecture. And I'll be back soon talking about the GPT-4 architecture and this mixture of experts concept and what they're doing there. So definitely give me a follow, like this video, subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon about that.